My name is Emily Hartley. 7 years ago, at our family's Christmas party in the estate, my father, a renowned physician, pointed at me in front of hundreds of guests and said, "Emily is no longer my daughter." I stood frozen, still holding a small gift I had bought with money from my part-time job. No one spoke, no one defended me, and no one walked me to the door as I stepped out of that cold mansion, erased from a family I once thought I belonged to. Have you ever been cast out by your own flesh and blood as if you never existed? If my story stirs something in you, I hope you'll share your thoughts below. Tap like and subscribe to the channel to hear the next part, where I didn't come back begging for forgiveness, but returned to make them learn how to say the name that makes an entire courtroom rise to its feet. Lucas and I used to be inseparable. We grew up in a house with a wide front porch, sneaking onto the roof to watch the sunset on summer evenings and falling asleep to our grandmother's fairy tales during thunderstorm nights. Lucas was 3 years younger, but he was always the one to say, "Let me go first. You just stand behind me." My little brother used to be the only safe place I knew in a world that never quite felt like mine. We had our own codes, shared every loose coin to buy ice cream, got punished together for breaking Mom's sewing machine out of curiosity. I still remember the day Lucas punched a boy in our class for calling me that weird little bookworm. He told me not to cry. That one day we'd have our own home, no need to become doctors like Dad, no more fake smiles during family gatherings. I believed him. Everything started to change when Lucas entered 6th grade. My father began taking him to the hospital every Saturday afternoon. At first it was just to observe, but soon it was clear Lucas had been chosen to carry on the Hartley legacy. At dinner, my father asked Lucas what he felt during his first open-heart surgery viewing, taught him how to read blood test results, and even started calling him Little Doctor. And me, I was told to wash the dishes properly, not ask too many questions, and most of all, not to step beyond what's acceptable for a Hartley girl. I wasn't jealous of Lucas. I was jealous of the way my father looked at him, with hope, with the kind of expectation I never received, not even when I was top of my class, when I won the statewide debate championship, or when I was invited to speak at our high school graduation. He didn't attend. He had my mother deliver the message: "Your father is on call. Your education doesn't outweigh a transplant surgery." I remember that summer at 17. I sat in the living room holding my Columbia Law application. My father stood by the window and gave me a cold smile. He didn't yell, didn't slam anything. He just said, "If you turn your back on medicine, don't expect anything from this family." I hoped my mother would speak up, but she didn't. Her eyes avoided mine. Her hands gripped a water glass she never drank from. Maybe she didn't agree with him, but she didn't have the strength to do anything else. She was never strong. She chose to live quietly in the shadow of her husband, the shadow of tradition, the shadow of every should and should not I never understood the weight of. Still, I submitted my application. Still, I left our small hometown for New York with 2 suitcases, some scholarship money, and a cramped apartment where the faucet dripped all night long. The day I left, Lucas didn't come to say goodbye. He sent a message. "I'm not allowed to go, but I believe in you. Don't let them snuff out your fire." I cried reading those words on the bus ride out of town, not out of heartbreak, but because somewhere deep down I had still hoped someone would ask me to stay. No one did. I used to believe that if I worked hard enough, became successful enough, they'd look back, but as the years passed, I realized, to them, I was already gone. Lucas called less and less, then not at all. I still followed his life on social media. He got into med school, earned honors, was celebrated at graduation with our parents front and center, beaming like he was the masterpiece they'd created. And me? When I became the youngest judge in the state, no one in the family called. Not a word, not a text. When the press ran the story, I let myself hope for a moment, but Mom stayed silent. Lucas never responded to my message, congratulating him on his engagement. I learned to pack it all away. The anger, the ache, the memories of calling each other secret teammates. I put them in a box, labeled it lost, and closed the drawer. But things like that never disappear. They just wait for the day you're forced to open it again. And that day is coming. I used to think that leaving my family would be the hardest part, but it wasn't. The hardest part was living through the years that followed, knowing no one had my back, no hand to catch me, no voice to come home to. Every morning in my third-floor walk-up in Harlem, I had to remind myself I was still moving forward. Whatever forward meant, I couldn't turn back. I worked at a bakery that opened at 5 a.m., washing trays, wiping counters, sometimes decorating cakes for birthdays of people I'd never meet. Classes began at 9. I'd scarf down a dry roll in the restroom, rush to lecture still dusted in flour. At night, I answered phones at a tiny law office in Brooklyn. Some nights I was so tired I'd fall asleep on the subway and nearly miss my stop. That winter was brutally cold. The window in my room had a crack that let the wind stab through like ice. I taped towels across it, sealed it with duct tape. Even under 2 coats, I'd shiver through the night on a sagging mattress. Sometimes I lay there wondering why I kept going. Were they secretly watching? Were they quietly proud I hadn't given up? But I wasn't naive. My father once told me, "Without an MD, you have no value." Words like that don't just fade away. In my second year of college, I joined a public interest law research group. One day, our professor brought us to a small courtroom downtown. It was a case about evicting a single mother for missing 3 months of rent. She stood there, baby in arms, eyes hollow with despair. The defense attorney arrived late, mumbled through his notes, and wrapped up in 3 minutes. I looked at the crying child, at the landlord's cold stare, then turned to my professor and asked, "Is this justice?" He just said quietly, "If you think it's wrong, be the one who makes it right." That was the moment I knew. I may not be a doctor like my father wanted, but I could still save lives in my own way. I shifted my focus to civil rights law. I spent countless hours in the library, poring over hundreds of pages of case law, writing memos for lawsuits other students deemed insignificant. Every time I won a case, even if it was just helping an elderly tenant avoid eviction over a shady lease agreement, I felt my heart light up like a lamp in the dark. After graduation, I got a job at a community justice office. The pay was laughably low, barely enough to cover rent and instant noodles. But I had no regrets. I handled dozens of cases each week: domestic violence, custody battles, exploitation by landlords or employers. The people I helped had no voice, no power. But I did, and I used it to speak for them. Still, not everyone saw what I did as something to be proud of. Every year, I sent Christmas cards home, even though no one replied. I mailed invitations to my graduation, to my swearing in as an attorney. All were met with silence. My mother sent one short line after I passed the bar exam: "Congratulations, take care of yourself." That was it. I folded that note, tucked it into my wallet, and never read it again. 3 years later, I was invited to serve as a clerk for a state judge, a woman who later became my mentor and my guiding light into the judiciary. She once looked at me and said, "You have the eyes of someone who's been hurt. That's what makes you different. And it's what will make you stronger than anyone else." I didn't know whether to thank her or reject those words, but I kept going. At 32, I was nominated for a federal judgeship, the youngest in Pennsylvania's history at the time. The swearing-in ceremony was held in a historic chamber, with soft golden light washing over every row of seats. Colleagues came, former clients came, even courthouse staff who had watched my journey were there. But no one from my family attended. After the ceremony, when everyone had left, I sat alone in the empty courtroom. I took off my heavy judge's robe, laid it on the bench, and looked around the room I once dreamed of during cold winter nights, beside a cracked window. I had made it, on my own. No congratulations, no bouquet bearing the Hartley name, but I had still made it, and that's a truth no one can erase. That morning, as I entered my office, I saw a cream-colored envelope sitting awkwardly on top of a stack of files my assistant had just delivered. I assumed it was an invitation to an upcoming legal conference or maybe a witness statement needing a signature. But when I picked it up, I froze. The dark blue cursive on the front, so familiar it sent a chill through me, read simply, Emily Hartley, personal. Not Judge Emily Hartley, not Office 302, just that name, as if I still lived in a house where no title was needed. I opened the envelope, a thick, silver-trimmed wedding invitation embossed with a classic floral pattern. The groom's name, Lucas Matthew Hartley. The bride, Chloe Elizabeth Monroe. The date was 3 weeks from now at the old church in our hometown, the same one where my parents were married back in 1983. I stared at Lucas's name, read it again, then closed my eyes for a moment. My brother was getting married, no one had told me. Not a phone call, not a message, but somehow the invitation had arrived, right at my office. Why? I turned the envelope over and found a small, folded note tucked inside. A handwritten letter. The slightly shaky script, tilted gently to the right, was instantly recognizable. My grandmother's writing, the last person who had hugged me tightly the night I left home. I still remember her grasping my shoulders, looking me in the eyes and saying, "Don't let anyone define you, not even family." I unfolded the letter. Dear Emmeline, I don't know if you still hold on to anything from the family, but if you're reading this, it means there's still a spark of hope in you. I can't tell you whether you should go or not, but I want you to understand one thing. If you don't show up, they will believe they were right to erase you. Don't let your silence be mistaken for agreement. I miss you. Right, Mom? I sat in silence. The letter was short, but it felt like something had grabbed me by the chest. All these years I'd told myself I had moved on, that I'd built a different life, but one line from her, and everything I had buried clawed its way back up like a box forced shut for too long. She was still alive, still watching, and somehow still believed I had the right to return, not to apologize, but to prove I was never wrong in the first place. I folded the letter, set it aside, and picked up my phone. I opened the browser and typed Chloe Monroe. I needed to know who the woman marrying my brother was. The first photo hit me like a punch. I recognized her instantly. Blonde hair tied neatly back, determined eyes, a careful yet firm smile. That was the woman who had stood before me 8 months ago in a public health dispute case, a young doctor from a public hospital in Philadelphia, representing a group of residents opposing the forced transfer of low-income patients. She had spoken clearly, confidently, citing data and case studies like someone who had lived through worse than what she described. She hadn't known who I was, just called me Your Honor with respectful detachment. I remember being impressed. The more I remembered, the more uneasy I felt. How could she not recognize me? How could someone preparing to marry Lucas not know I was his sister? Or had Lucas simply never mentioned me? I scrolled through Chloe's bio, internal medicine, top honors at Johns Hopkins, volunteer work in Appalachia. There was no trace of privilege, no sign of the high society background my parents typically sought in Lucas's partners. She wasn't the kind of woman dazzled by the Hartley name, or by the synthetic glow my father tried to wrap around his only son. I leaned back in my chair, wedding invitation still in hand, heart tangled like a ball of string. It wasn't jealousy, it wasn't bitterness, it was confusion. If Chloe truly didn't know who I was, then what had Lucas told her? Or more precisely, what hadn't he told her? I glanced again at my grandmother's letter. If you don't show up, they'll believe they were right. I pressed my hand to my chest, touching the little pendant she gave me when I turned 16, back when I was selected for the school's debate team. I wore it every time I needed to feel less alone. I hadn't thought of her that day in court, but now I was certain. She had been watching all along. I tucked the letter into my drawer, laid the wedding invitation on my desk, and closed my eyes. A part of me wanted to throw everything in the trash, lock the drawer, and return to a life untouched by the past. But another part, the girl who had once been cast out with no one stopping her, was stirring, and she was finally waking up. I didn't drive straight to the church printed on the invitation. I turned left instead, down a red dirt road leading to the small cemetery west of town, where my grandmother had rested for the past 3 years. When she was alive, she would sit by the window with a mug of mint tea, gaze out at the open fields, and say, "This town is too small to hold all your dreams, Emily. If you ever feel out of place, it's not because you're wrong. It's because this place is too tight." I parked beneath the old oak tree. The wind stirred through the overgrown grass, tossing my hair backward like it was dragging old memories out of me. Her headstone was as simple as the day it was placed. Eleanor Hartley, a woman who didn't live to please, but lived so she could smile at herself. She wrote that line herself before she passed. She once showed me the design and laughed. "I'm old, nothing left to fear. Least my grave should tell the truth." I sat beside her, laid a bouquet of white daisies on the cool soil. My hands trembled as I reached into my coat pocket and pulled out the weathered piece of paper. Her letter. The one she left for me in the drawer of my tiny studio apartment when I graduated law school. I had read it 100 times, but each time it still hit me the same. Don't ever think you're not enough just because you're different. They may carry the Hartley name, but that doesn't make them more noble than you. You weren't born to follow, you were born to leave footprints of your own. I read that line again, my eyes burned. Some words, no matter how well you know them, still make you cry like you're hearing them for the first time. I told her about my work, about the tough cases I had overcome, the single mothers I had helped retain custody, the children who once feared losing their homes but now lived exactly where they belonged. I didn't talk much about titles, positions, or degrees, because I knew she wouldn't care about any of that. The only thing she had ever wanted was for me to live true to myself. Leaves rustled gently around my feet. I closed my eyes for a moment, letting the wind brush across my face. Maybe it carried her words with it, soft but just strong enough to make me rise. I walked back to the car, but I didn't feel heavy. I knew exactly where I was going, why I needed to go, and how I would walk in. I wasn't returning to play a supporting role in some polished family portrait. I wasn't there to play nice in hopes of forgiveness or to be accepted again. I had come too far to become someone I could finally be proud of, and if they couldn't see that, that was on them. I popped the trunk and pulled out a small suitcase that Maya, my best friend, had packed with me, piece by piece. She had tucked in a forest green dress, polished but strong. "This makes you look like you don't need anyone's approval," she'd said, "but they'll still turn their heads." I brought along my grandmother's old pocket watch, a bracelet Lucas had given me in 6th grade, and a pair of low heels, the kind I could walk in all day without bowing my head from pain. That was all I needed. Not to impress, but to remind myself who I was. The road back into town looked the same, trees lining the edge. A worn-down gas station with a price sign that never seemed to change, and those pale green road signs fading with time. I drove slowly, recognizing each corner, each curve etched into my memory, not for nostalgia, but to affirm I had come back. Not as the small, uncertain Emily they once dismissed, but as the woman they cast aside, called a mistake, yet couldn't erase from the story. And I would walk in. No introduction needed, no permission required. I didn't need them to like me, but they would have to see me. And this time, I wasn't walking away in silence. I arrived at the Hartley estate on a damp afternoon, the sky overcast, like it, too, was holding its breath. Sleek cars lined the gravel path, their polished surfaces reflecting the perfectly trimmed maple trees. I stepped out and walked slowly toward the main lawn, where rows of white chairs had been arranged for the rehearsal. My dress flowed gently against my body, my heels tapped softly on the stone, and my grandmother's pocket watch felt heavier in my coat pocket than ever before. I hadn't even reached the edge of the lawn when a clear voice called out from the right. "Your Honor, I didn't expect to see you here." I turned. It was Chloe. Her blonde hair fell softly, a simple white dress, eyes wide with surprise and respect. She approached, gave a small bow. Exactly how I'd seen her do in court. Every sound around us seemed to pause. Laughter trailed off. Footsteps halted mid-stride. Everything froze for a few strange, quiet seconds. Lucas's head snapped up from the floral table. He saw me and froze, still holding a porcelain cup, motionless. His eyes darted from me to Chloe, then back, trying to make sense of what was unfolding. Behind him, none other than my father narrowed his eyes, cold as ice. He said nothing. He didn't move, just stood tall, as if he believed that if he held himself upright long enough, my presence would simply vanish. I gave a faint smile. No bowing, no flinching. I was invited, I said, eyes fixed on Lucas. And I came. Lucas's face drained of color. He took a few hesitant steps toward me, unsure of what to say. Chloe stood beside him, still unaware. I looked at her, and something in me tightened. Chloe had no idea. She had stood before me in court twice, called me Your Honor, debated legal protections for patients, but never knew I was the woman behind the family she was about to join. You're... Chloe asked softly, hesitant. Lucas inhaled. Chloe, this is Emily. She blinked. Emily? My sister, I added. And it seems no one in his family ever thought to mention me. The air in the garden thickened. Relatives whispered loudly enough to hear. Uncle Ronald stopped chewing. A young woman at the buffet took a step back, as though watching a slow-motion collision. I thought, Chloe stammered. Lucas said you weren't in touch with the family anymore, that you'd walked away because you couldn't handle the pressure. Close, I said, still looking at Lucas. Just got the verb wrong. Lucas winced. Emily, this isn't the time. Not the time to clarify a truth, I asked. Then when, Lucas? Chloe stepped back. She looked at my brother, then back at me, her gaze shifting from shock to confusion to growing unease. I didn't blame her. The injustice wasn't hers. It belonged to those who tried to rewrite an entire chapter, as if I had never existed. My father finally spoke. Emily, if you're here to make a scene, I turned toward him. I'm here because I was invited, by someone who still believed my presence mattered, not to cause trouble, not to be a spectacle, but to remind everyone that I never disappeared. I was pushed out. No one responded. The wind swept across the lawn, carrying the soft scent of lavender, trying in vain to soften the air. But my father's eyes remained sharp as knives. He hated that I hadn't obediently followed his path. But I didn't need his approval. Not anymore. Chloe finally broke the silence, her voice low but clear. You're Judge Hartley and Lucas's sister? Why, has no one ever told me this? Lucas opened his mouth, but no words came. There were no excuses left strong enough, no lie left sturdy enough to hold. The truth now stood in the center of the garden, wrapped in green silk and calm defiance. The woman their family had cast aside. Chloe stood there as if realizing the house she'd leaned on was made of sand. Her eyes searched the faces around her, looking for confirmation, or at least explanation, but every gaze turned away. The silence wasn't shock anymore. It was the silence of people who had just been exposed. Lucas? Chloe asked, her voice trembling slightly but steady. Why did you never tell me you had a sister? Lucas straightened, but his usual confidence had vanished. He looked toward our father, as if seeking a signal, but my father stayed silent. My mother, a few steps back, lowered her head, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. Because there wasn't much to tell, Lucas mumbled. She dropped out of med school, turned her back on everything the family stood for. Mom and Dad didn't want to talk about it anymore. Didn't want to talk about their daughter? Chloe raised her eyebrows. A woman who became a federal judge before 35? Who was on the cover of a legal journal last year for juvenile court reform? You told me your family valued hard work, that anyone who worked hard would be recognized. What about your sister? Lucas's face flushed. He turned toward me, eyes flickering with desperation. Emily, you know, you left. Everything back then was tense. Mom and Dad were disappointed, and I wasn't what they wanted either, I cut in. I chose a path that didn't exist on the map they laid out. That made me the scratch on the perfect portrait they painted. And you, the one who used to call me a hero when I stood up for you against the neighborhood kids, now you tell the woman you're marrying that I'm not even worth mentioning? Lucas clenched his fists. You don't understand. The pressure in this family has always been huge. I had to maintain the image, protect everything Dad built. So erasing me made it easier to breathe. I stepped forward. My voice wasn't loud, but it was clear enough for everyone nearby to hear. Because I didn't live up to expectations, it was inconvenient to mention that I was your sister. You were afraid Chloe would think less of you if she knew you had a sister who paid rent with scholarships and dishwashing shifts. Chloe turned to Lucas. You told me she dropped out because she couldn't handle it, because she wasn't strong enough. Lucas inhaled sharply. I didn't want you to feel like our family had cracks in it. I gave a soft laugh, not out of humor. You don't need to lie to cover the cracks, Lucas, because those cracks are what make me different. But don't call me weak. I'm not weak for choosing not to stay where no one respected my path. I'm not weak for refusing to bow to a tradition that treats people like carbon copies. I just chose a road that didn't need anyone's permission. I didn't know how many people were listening, but I saw a few heads nod ever so slightly. A distant cousin looked down, avoiding my eyes. One of my father's colleagues, who once publicly dismissed my reform proposal at a conference 2 years ago, now looked at me like he was finally seeing what he had chosen to ignore. Chloe stood in silence for a long moment. Then she spoke, not angrily, but with a quiet disappointment. You once told me your family stood for integrity. You said everything you had came from them teaching you to live rightly. But if living rightly means bending the truth, what exactly are you protecting, Lucas? No one responded. The wind moved through the garden again. In the distance, a few notes from a speaker test drifted over from the band setting up for the main event. But where I stood, everything remained still, like the years I had lived in silence. Only this time, the silence didn't belong to me. Later, after the rehearsal had quieted down, I walked toward the back garden, where my grandmother once grew herbs and lavender. The breeze here was gentler, the space quieter. I stood by the old brick wall and reached out to touch a mint sprig pushing through the cracks. The scent brought back afternoons spent trimming leaves beside her, while my mother silently scrubbed laundry just outside. A soft voice called from behind, "Emily." I turned. It was my mother. She wore a long, pale brown dress, her hair pinned neatly. Her face was something both familiar and distant. Her eyes lingered on me, like she was finally seeing something she hadn't dared face in years. She didn't come close right away. She just stood there, holding a worn leather notebook tied with a faded ribbon. I was up all night looking for this, she said, her voice hoarse. It was in the bottom drawer of Grandma's old wardrobe. She held the notebook out to me. I took it. Inside were neatly clipped color newspaper articles, each preserved in plastic. A magazine cover from the year I won the juvenile justice reform case. A local paper's piece about my speech at a judicial conference. A photo of me standing among a group of children at a community center. One I helped save from closure due to budget cuts. I cut every single one by hand. Some I had to ask friends in other states to mail me, she said, not taking her eyes off my hands, flipping through the pages. I always followed your journey. I just never had the courage to say it. I couldn't go against your father. I wasn't strong enough to protect you when you needed it most. I gripped the album tightly. Then why keep these if you weren't going to tell me? She pressed her lips together as if fighting back tears. Because I needed to prove to myself that you still existed in this family. That you weren't a stranger. I know it's not enough. I know I was wrong. But every time your father called you a disappointment, I snuck another one of your clippings and kept it for myself. I didn't respond. Not out of anger, but because the knot in my chest wasn't something a few words could untie. I looked down at those yellowing pages, at the headlines celebrating a woman my father had labeled too weak to carry the torch, and I realized I had spent my whole life trying to prove something. That maybe, just maybe, my mother had seen all along. I read everything she said, even your thesis. I didn't understand all of it, but I kept it anyway. I gave a sad smile. You know, Dad would never read any of it. No, she admitted. But I read it for him. We stood quietly. The wind tugged lightly at the hem of my dress. A sparrow landed on the distant fence, chirped softly, then flew off again. Eventually, my mother stepped forward and placed her hand on mine. I'm sorry for never speaking up, but I hope if there's one thing you need to know, it's this. I never stopped believing you'd go far. I just wish I'd been brave enough to walk with you. I didn't answer right away, but I left my hand in hers, a gesture I hadn't made in 7 years. Less than an hour later, as I returned to the main house to retrieve my coat, Lucas appeared in the doorway. He wore a white shirt, the top button undone, his expression still unsettled. I was about to pass him, but he spoke first. Do you have a minute? I stopped and nodded. He led me to the back hallway, the one we used to sneak down as kids to play cards on winter nights, stuffing towels under the old wooden door to keep the cold out. I didn't expect any of this, Lucas said, leaning against the wall. I didn't think Chloe would react like that, but I guess I shouldn't be surprised. I stayed quiet. He continued. I've always been jealous of you, not because you were better, but because you did what I couldn't. You left. You lived without anyone holding you up, and I stayed. I tried to be what Dad wanted, even when it exhausted me. I looked at him. The boy who once trailed after me all summer, who used to tape his drawings on my bedroom door, now stood before me, admitting that all this time, he wasn't the chosen one. He was just the one who chose to comply. And Grandma, he said, his voice catching, she loved you the most. I knew it. I was mad at her for that. Why did she always hug you when you argued with Dad? Why did she take you to the theater, but I had to stay home and practice piano? I didn't understand until I read everything you've done. I realized maybe she didn't love you because you were right. She loved you because you were brave enough not to pretend. I didn't say anything. I didn't know what to say. Lucas wasn't looking for forgiveness. He needed someone to understand that he too had lived under the weight of what seemed like honor, but was really pressure that cracked us all from the inside out. I'm not sorry for being loved more, he said, eyes fixed on the wooden floor. I'm sorry I let you be alone all those years. I know I could have called, but I didn't. I was afraid that if I heard your voice, I'd have to face the parts of myself I kept trying to deny. The wind blew softly through the hallway. I heard the faint clink of a glass door somewhere down the corridor. I just stood there, facing the brother who had once meant everything, then nothing at all. And now, somehow, he was returning as something I didn't yet have a name for. The next morning, I was still in the old living room, holding a cup of untouched coffee, when a sharp cry rang out from upstairs. It was my mother. I ran down the hall, up the stairs, and found her standing outside my father's bedroom, trembling, face pale. My father was slumped against the wall, one hand clutching his chest, face ashen, his forehead beaded with cold sweat. Everything inside me snapped into place, not out of habit, but instinct. I helped him sit up, kept his head supported, and pulled out my phone to call emergency services. While we waited, I dug into my coat pocket and retrieved his insurance information, something I'd written down the night before, just in case, a habit formed from years of dealing with healthcare legal cases. His hand gripped mine lightly, his breath short and rapid, his mouth moving without sound. When the ambulance arrived, I rode with him. Lucas ran behind, panicked and speechless. My mother stood still, tears falling silently, as if she had known this was coming for a long time. At the hospital, I filled out the admission forms, answered the intake nurse's questions, verified the insurance, and coordinated with a doctor I knew. I did it all without being asked and without waiting for thanks. Sometimes instinct becomes duty, and I didn't feel like I had another choice. Once my father was stable in the observation room, the nurse informed us he had suffered a minor ischemic episode, likely without lasting damage. I visited him after the doctor finished checking in. He lay still, head propped up on a high pillow, the sunlight from the window etching every wrinkle on his forehead more sharply than I remembered. I started to step back to give him rest, but he opened his eyes. They weren't sharp anymore, they were damp and softer, as if carrying a weight he could no longer deny. "Emily," he whispered. I stood still. "I'm here." He reached out his hand. Slow, unsteady, but deliberate. I stepped forward and placed my hand in his. This hand that had once slammed the dinner table when I questioned the family's plan. Now it was soft, trembling, clinging to mine, like letting go would make me vanish again. "Your grandmother," he began, breathless. "She once said, if a father can't be proud of his daughter just because she's different from him, then maybe the failure lies with the father." He paused, eyes locked on mine. "And now, I think she was right." I bit my lip. My chest ached, but I didn't let the tears fall, not yet. Not out of anger, but because I didn't know what to do with the weight of that sentence. It wasn't quite an apology, but from a man like my father, who had used silence as a weapon for decades, it was a bow deeper than any praise I had ever dreamed of receiving. He squeezed my hand, not tightly, but not weakly either. "You don't need to be like anyone else, Emily. You did something I never had the courage to do. Live a life without asking anyone's permission." That's when I turned my face away. But not fast enough. A tear slipped down onto the back of his hand, sinking into the pale, aging skin. I didn't cry because I was forgiven. I cried because, for the first time in over 30 years, my father spoke to me without disappointment in his voice. I sat by his bedside for a long time after that. We didn't say much. We didn't need to. Some things can't be fixed with words. But one look, one grasp of a hand, sometimes that's enough to patch up what once felt permanently broken. A year later, my office sat on the 6th floor of the federal courthouse, overlooking the city square where rows of birch trees stood bare. Snow drifted quietly outside, laying a soft sheet across the glass pane clouded with breath. I had just finished a morning hearing and was reorganizing my case files when the door opened gently. Chloe stepped in. Her hair was shorter now. She wore a gray wool coat that reached her knees, and her eyes still carried that same direct gaze I remembered from her first appearance in court. But now there was something else, a grounded maturity, like someone who had walked a long road and no longer walked it alone. "Judge Hartley," she said, offering a gentle smile. "I hope I'm not interrupting." I nodded and motioned for her to sit. "Please, everything okay?" "Better than I expected." Chloe took the seat across from me, her hands resting on a brown leather portfolio. "I wanted to ask if you'd consider serving as legal advisor for a nonprofit I just launched with a few colleagues." I tilted my head. "What kind of organization?" "We're calling it the Second Door," she said, her eyes lighting up. "We focus on protecting the legal rights of patients who are denied care or discriminated against in the healthcare system, especially the uninsured, immigrants, and vulnerable communities." I stayed quiet for a few seconds. Part of me was surprised, another part wasn't. Chloe had always carried that spark. I just needed time to see it. "Believe," she continued, "there's no one better than you to help us build a solid legal advisory system. You fought for things others saw as lost causes, and you saw me, even before I knew who you were." I leaned back in my chair, eyes drifting to the window. The snow was falling heavier now. Thick, quiet flakes layered the windowsill, as if trying to blur the sharp edges of time. I slid my hand into my coat pocket and touched the pocket watch my grandmother had left me, the only thing I've kept through the last 10 years. Its hands still moved, slow but steady, every tick like a quiet reminder. Time may fade wounds, but it never erases the truth. I looked back at Chloe and nodded. I'll do it, but on one condition. What condition? Huh. I don't want to be part of this because of my name or any title I hold, I said. I want to walk alongside you as someone who knows what it feels like to be shut out of the system. I want to make sure the people you help won't be forced to fit someone else's mold just to be allowed to exist. Chloe smiled. That's exactly what I hoped for. She stood, shook my hand with both of hers, then paused at the door. Oh, she said softly, Lucas is working as a community doctor out in Oregon now. He said it's the first time he's ever felt truly useful. I nodded without saying anything. I didn't need the details. I only needed to know that my brother had finally stepped off the track our parents clung to so tightly. Maybe, at last, he understood what I had spent my youth fighting for. After Chloe left, I remained at my desk, hand resting gently over the watch in my pocket. I hadn't come back for forgiveness. I hadn't returned to fit into the family portrait they painted without me. I came back to stand tall. To make them relearn how to see a person, not through a medical degree or a family name, but through her choices and her conviction. That's my story, not for pity, not to wrap things up with a picture-perfect embrace under the glow of redemption, but the story of a daughter cast out by her own family who returned, not to apologize, but to live by her truth. I don't know what you would have done if you were in my place. Would you have come back? Would you be strong enough to stand in front of the people who once broke you and say, I didn't disappear. I was just rebuilding my life on my terms? If there's one thing I hope you'll share with me today, it's this. Where do you see yourself in this story? I want to hear from you. Leave a comment below, whether it's your own story or just a feeling that came up as you listened to mine. And if stories about family, about choices, and about learning to rise from what once seemed impossible stir something inside you, then follow this channel. There are many more stories waiting to be told. Unimperfect journeys, but honest and full of strength, just like life itself.